Good morning, everyone. I'm Kiki Edozie. I'm currently the interim dean for the John McCormack School of Policy and Global Studies here at UMass Boston, with WBUR, the Boston Globe, and WCVB, Channel 5, at McCormack's UMass Boston. We are proud sponsors of last night's historic second Boston Mayoral debate at City Space. Today's post-debate panel discussion is being hosted as part of McCormack's Massachusetts election debate series. But it's also launching of, can we mute, I think Jennifer Gooding, please? Thank you. Today's event also launches for McCormack a new speaker series. Well, we're calling it Policy Across Disciplines. This will be a dialogue event that invites a range of public service speakers, including scholars, as we have today, public servants, politicians, to engage discussion, deliberation, dialogue, and debate, especially on some of the most, I think, critical policy dilemmas of our times in local, national, and global context. As example, I'd like us to take a few seconds right now to observe the 20-year memorial event of 9/11. Thank you. Our next panel discussion will engage the president's withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan last week, marking the end of a controversial intervention and what it all means. Yesterday's debate also embodied a sort of discussion, manifestation of our policy across disciplines mission. From post-COVID issues, including vaccination mandates, mask mandates, eviction moratoriums, gentrification, opium and drug usage, abject poverty and homelessness, wealth creation and inequality, educational leadership, transportation, and the effects of climate change. Nothing was left undebated. For Boston, it can't be emphasized more how this is an historic mayoral election. 3.5 years ago, in 2017, the Boston Globe actually described the racial politics of Boston as a power outage. Let me quote what the Boston Globe's Spotlight team wrote. Despite Boston's reputation as a liberal bastion, the region's power base remains largely white men. Blacks' political achievements are more occasional than institutional. There are no Black faces in Massachusetts' congressional delegation, nor among statewide offices, and the only Black to win election to statewide office since 1972 is former Governor Deval Patrick. Such infrequent electoral victories are different from an ongoing voice in all affairs of the city. So in 2018, after that, Ayanna Pressley was elected as the first candidate of color to represent Massachusetts in Congress. And in 2021, Kim Janey was appointed the first candidate of color and woman to hold the position of mayor, or albeit acting mayor, of Boston. And so with 5 major candidates for women and all candidates of color, including Anissa Alcibie-George, we know one thing for sure. The next mayor of Boston will be a woman or a mayor of color for the first time. So to moderate today's discussion, we have 3 excellent experts. I don't know if Trevor is in the room now.
Hello. Yes, I'm here.
Trevor is here. Trevor is with us. I'd like to introduce Trevor as our student panelist. Trevor is a second-year master's in public administration student at UMass Boston here. He was born in Kenya and came to the United States when he was 10 years old and went to Everett Public Schools. He studied political science also for his undergraduate studies at UMass Boston, and he is now interested in general public policy and law with a keen interest in healthcare policy and law. At last night's debate, Trevor asked, a fantastic question. He asked the candidates a question about the violence in the city and in urban centers around the country. The candidates responded with what I think was a vibrant discussion about criminal justice reform in the city, and that is another critical policy issue debate of our times that we will be taking up here at McCormack. Now let me move to Dr. Erin O'Brien, second panelist. She is the Associate Professor of Political Science here at UMass Boston. Professor O'Brien served previously, at least, as a lead policy consultant on the Marty Walsh 2013 successful mayoral bid here in Boston. But she's a regular political commentator. I just want to quote, this is what I saw as the latest, although I know that she's been had a lot to say about these elections. But in April 2021, I found it interesting that she wrote this about acting Mayor Kim Janey. Every candidate wants to be her right now, said O'Brien. The others are going to say what they would do. Janey will say what she has been doing. And so I thought about that last night watching the debate, actually. I thought about those comments, which I had prepared previously to the debate. So we can see that Erin O'Brien, as a political commentator and analyst, is always on point. She's also the author of two, I think, timely books as well. The Politics of Identity, Solidarity among Building Among Americans Working Poor, and Diversity in Contemporary American Politics and Government. Thank you, Dr. O'Brien. And then we have Dr. Michael Johnson, who is a professor, and he's also the chair of our Department of Public Policy and Public Affairs right here at UMass Boston. Michael has actually also recently impacted on today's historic election. He recently worked with Dan O'Brien at Northeastern University and Catherine Lusk at Boston University. Both and Michael are members of the Boston Area Research Initiative, which develops a series of white papers on important issues that they claim our Boston mayoral candidates should know. The papers are on energy, public safety, housing, and transportation, and they have been shared with the campaigns of all the major candidates. Dr. Johnson coordinated the development of the housing white paper within that larger white paper report with Karen Horn of UMass Boston's Economics Department and Megan Kalman of the School of Global Inclusion and Social Development. Michael Johnson, Professor Johnson, is widely published in a number of areas on operations research and housing public policy. Thank you, Michael, for joining us today as well. And so with that, I will open up the panel discussion to each of our panelists to share a 7-minute commentary on their impressions of last night's debate. I believe I want to begin with Trevor. And if we could spotlight Trevor, please, Jacqueline.
I'm sorry?
Thank you.
Oh.
There we go.
Hello. So some of the highlights I thought about the debate, I especially wanted a good response to my question because I think it's very important. I think that's something that people of color deserve is safety and being able to feel comfortable in their homes. So I thought the candidates answered that very well. I thought the COVID question, there was not a very clear answer to me, at least. I thought it's a developing question, so I understand where the candidates stand. But I would also like to have heard a more direct question, a direct answer about the vaccine passports and testing and mandating masks in schools and things like that. I thought the candidates also had a good response to the housing crisis. I felt that they felt that it's an important thing to Boston residents, and they especially pointed out the problems going on at Mass Ave and how their plans can help solve that problem, especially in terms of housing a lot of unhoused people, as well as giving Boston residents who don't have very much substantial housing. So I thought that was very good as well. And I also thought the responses to the eviction notice was also very good. I think the candidates should stick with the moratorium because a lot of people still have not found jobs, or some people are still scared to go out because of COVID. So I think the eviction moratorium is a good thing. I'm not sure how long it's going to last. I think that was something that the candidates couldn't really specify, but I thought for the most part that was a very good response. And for me, I felt the closing statements were good as well. I thought somebody like John Barrows, who needed the spotlight a little bit more, he did pretty well. I also thought Andrea Campbell stood out very much. And I thought the candidates overall did very well as well.
Thank you, Trevor. Trevor, do you mind just saying a little bit more about your question, the question that you asked about violence and how you felt the candidates responded? You said they responded very well, but tell us how they responded very well.
So I think the candidates were talking about focusing on things that contribute to crime, such as lack of housing, lack of healthcare, lack of educational and job opportunities. So I thought that was a very good response, especially I believe it was Andrea Campbell who was talking about how the connection between how the lack of education opportunities failed her brother, and that's another way that people fall into crime and things like that. So I thought that was a good way of personalizing a lot of the answers. And I think she also said she would like to have more cops on the beat, doing more community policing. So I thought that was a very good answer. I think that's a good way of making community policing that's valuable to both the police and the people. So I think, to me, she stood out the most, Andrea. But I thought the candidates, they mostly talk about the things that contribute to crime, such as housing, lack of education opportunities. And I felt that that was a very good answer in terms of trying to find the underlying causes of crime instead of just thinking we should just have more cops on the streets or things like that.
Thank you so much, Trevor. Okay, Dr. O'Brien, your turn. 7 minutes.
It's always difficult to follow someone who really knocks it out of the park. Trevor. I want to go before Trevor. My reactions have some triangulation with what Trevor said, especially the ways in which they looked at the structural causes of crime. So I'm going to take those out of my notes because they covered it. I thought I would start with the 2 points going into the debate that I was focused on. And the first is that, quite frankly, this is a race for number 2 right now. Michelle Wu will get through to the general election. That doesn't mean she will win. Marty Walsh in 2013 came in second in the primary and went on to win in the general. But for the immediate issues in Boston right now, in terms of electoral politics, this is a race for number 2 to get to that primary. and the other 3 women running are the ones who are viable. Anissa George and Andrea Campbell are trending up in the polls, and Kim Janey has been trending down. It's Anissa Sabi George is the only one who has run at large because she is an at-large counselor, which means that she presumably has a better get out the vote apparatus simply because she's had to do it citywide before, where the other 2 have obviously been quite effective because they won, but they won in districts, so they don't have a Boston-wide network. I suspect they do, but they have to build it. Given that that is the race for number 2, I think a lot of us, self-included, have been very excited that we might have a Black mayor. I think there is a real possibility that Michelle Wu and Anissa George are the ones who get into the general election. And I think a lot of individuals would be quite disappointed by that. That's not to say, I see my colleague Paul Watanabe, who runs the Asian American Institute and has done amazing work in that area. That's not to say that Asian Americans in Boston have been treated well. They have not. And I mean that quite sincerely, but I think that is a potential dynamic if Andrea Campbell or Kim Janey don't emerge to face Wu. I think a lot of people in Democratic politics circles, that's the race they want, because quite frankly, it's from a representation standpoint, it's the race that's best for Boston. In terms of my impressions of the candidates from last night, first I want to say thanks to the McCormack School for hosting a really superb event. I always love it when I hear our name on the radio, solidarity with the fam. And so I'm just going to go through, I looked at the Globe this morning and I think their read on the race was totally wrong in the grades. It's clear to me they're not faculty. We have to have data for our grades. And I don't know who wrote it, so I'm not cutting on them personally. But in terms of Anissa Sabi George, Trevor made some reference of this. I thought her answer on the eviction moratorium was wildly telling. The host, I forget which host, asked, are any of you willing to get rid of the eviction moratorium? Awkward pause, awkward pause, awkward pause. And she said she'd end it. Now, she did say she'd end the moratorium and, have wraparound services for people who are potentially could be evicted. But to me, I think what she's doing is playing for that center lane. When she says 200 or 300 more cops, she, as Trevor noted, says, these are community policing. But conservative and moderate ears who don't feel like they're being represented in this race, Anissa George, I think, is making the play for them. I don't know if that's good or bad, but strategically, that's what she's doing. Or I should say, I don't know if that's normatively good or bad. I have some ideas there, but strategically, that's what she's doing. And I think it's potentially smart if you want to get into that in the general. I thought John Barrows was superb last night. Michael Johnson and I were talking before everybody came in, and I think the reason he's not doing well is just simply a path dependence issue. He got in later. He was the only candidate to really go at Wu substantively on policy. When I say he went hard on her, that's not bad, because they were policy critiques. He came at her on mass and caste, and he also said, rent control is a nice buzz phrase, but how is it actually going to make Boston more affordable for most Bostonians? And I thought his answer was superb when they said, name a city that's countered gentrification. He said, I won't name a city, I'll name the Dudley Street Project, of which he is central. And I was like, what is it? I wish I had a moment where I could do a mic drop like that. I thought Kim Janey, this is Kiki very kindly gave a quote I gave to the Times in April. And I think it shows this is the good and the bad of being acting mayor. You get to show what you've done, but when they present to you on the first day of school, only 57% of buses were on time. Kim Janey owns that. Now, of course, all of us on here know that's a little bit unfair. Kim Janey's not driving the buses, but fair isn't political. And so, you know, it's only a week between late buses and you have to run. And so I just think owning the policy was negative for her last night. I'll finish up with the final two before I turn it over to my colleague, Michael. I thought Andrea Campbell, I thought a little bit different than Trevor. I thought it was the tale of two halves. The first half, I thought she was superb. The second half, I just, you know, I don't remember what she did. She was less memorable to me, but I thought she was absolutely superb when she said, when asked about mass and cast, she said, listen, everybody up here, they covered that district and they took no action. She'll actually have a plan. So she was able to say mass and cast, the other four people had direct hands in this. I didn't. Excuse me. And last, I'll say, I think Wu was a non-entity last night. She just played it safe. I'm struggling here with a cough. She knows that she's going to get into that general election, and I found her unmemorable last night, but I also thought that was a smart strategic decision because she, you know, why make any mistakes? So she played, I'm teaching sports and politics this semester. She played what we call prevent defense. And those are my takeaways.
Great, Erin, thank you so much. That was very informative. I just have a quick question for you though, in terms of, you know, Kim Janey's candidacy. You know, why isn't this election hers to win? So I understand the contradictions of incumbency.
Yeah.
She had a rocky 6 months, you know, although I thought that going into the debate myself, I thought, you know, she's done. You know, this is a race between Wu and you know, not so much George, but Campbell, right? You know, but I came out, you know, saying, oh my goodness, you know, look at Janey. She's she had the demure and confidence of a long time incumbent. I thought her response, you know, on the report card on buses on time was, you know, fantastic. She said it's 57%, but it's the highest ever. It's higher than last year, and it's higher than the average. And there's context. You know, I just thought she gave, you know, answers that were, you know, confident, reasonable, common sense, no jingles. So I don't know how that's going to come across, but it came across to me as better than the impression that I had of her going in.
I think I mean, anytime you're arguing 57% is good in politics, it is better than before, but it's still not great, right? Yeah. Like, and that's what I mean about it. I think it's a somewhat unfair critique, but voters are going to make that critique on her. Yeah. I think you're right. She has passed a lot more progressive legislation than she gets credit for. She's done things, but all the noise in Boston politics has been, you know, a bit of a steady decline with her. And I think what's, you know, I'm also teaching women in politics this semester. And I think what's really interesting is that unfairly, I think, Kim Janey, by the other counselors, by Asabe George, by Wu, by Andrea Campbell, feel like she jumped the line by running. And so like, I think it might be a good thing that you don't have to have a sisterhood to win, but I also think the sisterhood turned on her. You know, if you remember in June, the council voted to say that they have the right to take the acting mayor away from her. You know, that I think that was a design to get at, make her look small and get at her confidence and things like that. So as you said, Kiki, we're seeing the double-edged sword of being the first. And I don't think she expected attacks from her fellow counselors, and the double-edged sword of being the acting mayor.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you. All right, Dr. Johnson. Michael.
Thank you. Thank you to Erin and Trevor for their comments. I felt last night that 4 of the 5 candidates projected a sense of competence and basic familiarity with important issues and a temperament that I'd associate with the chief executive of a public organization. And I have to rank Nisa Sabi George just a little lower than the other 4 candidates in this regard. And I've observed the candidates expressing, sharp differences with each other in other venues. But last night they seemed, again, with one exception, to me, primarily John Barros, to strive to be in alignment with many issues. There was lots of cosigns, and I agree with what my colleague has said. Regarding public health, it was heartening that all agree that vaccines are most effective and public health and science should guide decision-making. But I saw Andrea Campbell and Michelle Wu and John Barros as strongest in favor of city-level vaccine mandates across schools and businesses. And as a chief executive, I was disheartened to hear Kim Janey essentially endorse outsourcing that important decision to individual entities. All of them were in favor of comprehensive and regional solutions to the mass on caste problem, but I didn't hear a lot of specifics except from John Barros, who promised on-street 24-hour multidisciplinary teams. I don't know if that will make a difference, but it sounded impressive to me. Regarding housing, so I think Aaron noted this, that all of them except Anissa Sabi George endorsed the city eviction moratorium. And I think all of them emphasized a range of services like rental relief fund, increased staffing for the housing office, down payment assistance, and the like. And again, I noticed that John Barros, but along with Andrea Campbell, provided the most specifics on housing and community development responses to gentrification. I agree with Aaron that he stood and delivered in holding a Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative as a model. So I work in urban housing policy, and I was really impressed with the candidate's familiarity with all these different tools like community land trust, zoning reform, and community development. I agree that there's a substantive debate to be had about rent control. And I thought the argument was at a pretty high level last night because John Barros touted his credentials, which appear to be legitimate to me as someone who's built schools and housing and introduced jobs. Andrea Campbell had a question to her about charter schools, and she punted. And that's unfortunate because I, as just a voter, need to know more about supposedly pro-charter money supporting Andrea Campbell and the role that she thinks charter schools ought to play in the primary and secondary elementary ecosystem in Boston. She said BPS worked for her, but not for her brother. And she said she had a plan, but she didn't say much about it. And so I would have wanted more information. So there's more I could say about the debate, but I want to add my personal impressions of the candidates. So Kim Janey tried to do what chief executives always do, which is to project, an authoritative image. I've been here forever, taking credit for accomplishments, even if the numbers don't align with the descriptors like on-time buses. But I'm doing better than the city has done in the past. We're trending upward. Andrea Campbell emphasized the localized work she's done as a district councilor. I thought that was pretty powerful, along the lines of John Barros saying, this is what I've specifically done. And as Aaron noted, Michelle Wu, I thought, kept her remarks pretty general, which is what a front runner might do. And of the candidates, John Barros had the strongest performance, I'd say. I didn't hear much from Anissa Sabi George that persuaded me that she was a particularly innovative thinker or one who could speak to the broad diversity of the city. Because I do a little bit of work in planning, I was particularly disappointed in her toss-off comment about tree canopy by saying we just need to plant more trees. I thought that was tacky and rude. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much. And my question to you is about, and please don't feel that my question is unfairly targeted at you, but it's about John Barros and his candidacy. I understand this morning that he's polling at about 3%. And so why do you think he's such a great candidate? Is this not the election for the male anything? Whether it's a white male or a black male?
Well, So this is a little complicated, and so I'm going to take off my professor hat, my expert, and talk more as a resident, and my African American identity. So before I came to Boston, I had hardly ever heard of Cape Verdeans, and I had really not been familiar with the diversity of the African diaspora in Boston as compared to where I'd lived for 10 years before, which is Pittsburgh. And so I, have observed these distinctions in our community among Black people coming from different places and claiming different nationalities and cultural origins. And I bring that perception with me when I evaluate or get to learn candidates. And so it seemed clear to me that, I observed that John Barros represented a particular community, and he didn't engage me personally as someone who assertively would represent the Black community. I don't know if that's fair for any candidate to say so, but I brought that with me. I don't think he's particularly strong on the charisma department, but last night was a revelation for me. I believe he's very competent, but I also think a lot of voters, we've been really brutalized these past 4 or 5 years, and I don't think anybody's trying to do protest voting. They're saying, this is the person I want to win. Maybe if there were ranked voting, John Barros would be a little higher in the polls.
Well, thank you. That's a very honest, response. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you all three, Trevor, Erin, and Michael, for what wonderful, informative, dynamic analysis of the election on the one hand and the debate last night on the other. But now we'd like to open it up to questions from you in the audience. You have your say, ask or query any of our three panelists on, policy issues of the day that were raised, last night. You can put your answers in chat or your questions in chat if you'd like, or you could just, raise your hand and let's have a, town hall. The election is, after all, on Tuesday next week. So, I think these three experts can break it down for you and help you, make a choice. All right, it's open to the three of you. And while we're waiting for questions, which I believe Jack is compiling for us, let me ask, the three of you another question. And this time, on the issues. I want to start with what is really a controversial issue, not just for the 5 candidates last night, but it's nationwide. President Biden just gave a speech yesterday on vaccine mandates. Do you think that Kim Janey is getting a bad rap for her position on she made a decision finally to mandate vaccinations, but her decision is influenced by what she says are equity considerations, and people feel that the equity considerations are really a sort of opening to the denialists, which is not what Boston is all about. Any comments on that? Vaccine mandates and how that is being debated and used as a hard decision to evaluate these candidates.
I personally think she gave the best answer she could, because as rightly as the panelists were saying that 60% of Mattapan isn't vaccinated, and I think 40% of East Boston. So I think it's a complicated issue, and I think as an executive, you want to balance public safety, but you also don't want to keep out people of color who are going to be the ones who are mostly affected by this policy. So I'm in favor of maybe having it in certain areas where there's a lot of like let's say public transport. I mean, like concerts or something where there's a lot of people per se. But I'm not sure how effective it would be if, like, let's say we had vaccine passports at the supermarket, because some people may be immunocompromised, so we gotta also understand about them. But I think it's a complicated question. I think she gave the best answer she could, in the sense that it's still a developing question, and you don't want to exactly keep people out of certain places.
Thank you, Trevor. Any others? Erin, go ahead.
My take is that, unfortunately, as somebody put in the chat, most Bostonians didn't watch or listen to the debate, their loss. But I think what Janie is being, what a lot of Bostonians remember is her line, and she did work to clean it up after the fact, of comparing vaccine mandates and vaccine cards to Jim Crow. And Kiki, what you said in terms of if she had said instead, I have major equity concerns and the historical legacy of the way people of color, especially Black people, have been treated by the medical establishment, that vaccine cards, there was a way to say that, and she didn't say it that way. Her underlying point, I think, was good. And I think and note Andrea Campbell, another Black female running, the next day was like, this is irresponsible. It's our community that is being disproportionately affected. So my working hypothesis, and I want to chart the data on it, is just a hypothesis. I'm willing to reject it. But that was the beginning of the public downfall of Kim Janey.
Michael, any take on that?
I'd like to add, Trevor, thank you very much for your sort of nuanced comment. I agree that we would not want the city to implement a policy that will exclude large swaths of vulnerable communities. I think we can ask what kinds of activities, things like mandatory vaccine or sort of vaccine cards might be appropriate. We might highlight discretionary activities like entertainment and activities where there are large numbers of particularly vulnerable people, like public education, as places where we would start with vaccine mandates, and also make it easy for people who want vaccine cards to get them. But this is policy design and implementation. I mean, that's what a sophisticated city like Boston ought to be able to do. I agree with Erin that framing it as an equity issue rather than using the loaded historical terms didn't do Kim Janey any favors.
Thank you all. So Roxi Harvey has a question. I'm going to highlight her to ask that question. But before that question, Lorna Rivera had a question in the chat, and the question is, was the issue of elected versus appointed school committee discussed in the elections, in the debates last night, because she missed them? I didn't hear, that specificity, but I did want to ask my panelists about the C grade that the superintendent got from most of the candidates. In fact, Campbell gave her a D, and Janey sort of, gave her a B+, but acknowledged all the weaknesses of school leadership at this time. Does any of you want to talk about educational policy under this particular superintendent and, any of the controversies there?
I would say it's fair, but at the same time, we also have to understand the conditions that we're in. COVID is something none of us have ever experienced. And I think crafting school policy in times of COVID is very difficult. So I think that in some, I think Andrea gave her a D, which I thought was very unfair, in my opinion. I think maybe she has like a B or maybe a C plus in my opinion, because some things, yes, like how was 57% of kids should, that statistic should fall on her. But I also think crafting school policies, it's very difficult in times of COVID because the masking policy is very, it's very different in terms of different districts, even from the state. The guidance is very difficult to craft. So I think she's done a good job in the sense with her conditions, but it could be better.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to add that there's a lot that goes into developing school policy, and I'm not an education expert, so I'm speaking more as a BPS parent. My older son graduated from the John B. O'Brien School of Science and Math. My younger son is a senior there. And I would like an educational leader like the superintendent to be a visible thought leader on important issues, one who leads with well-defined and potentially impactful initiatives, one who can start productive conversations and persuade the public that on a couple of key initiatives, they can do things to make a difference. And on most of those dimensions, I haven't seen the superintendent take that kind of role. And that's been kind of disappointing. There's a lot of valid criticism about the drift of the public schools over the past few years. And I just haven't heard from the superintendent. I acknowledge this. Here is what I'm doing to make this better. Here are my top initiatives. And she's had a number of self-inflicted wounds. Letting your certification lapse is just a really bad look. I don't want to take her down. I don't want to give her a grade that doesn't acknowledge the good work the school district did to keep things going in the COVID era. But the past few years haven't inspired a lot of confidence for me in her.
No, thank you. Now I see two new hands up, but Roxy, are you in the house? I don't see your hand.
I am.
Oh, there you go. So go ahead and ask a question. You've been patient.
Thank you so much. So similarly, I was not able to watch the whole thing. So I was hoping that the panelists would be able to give their impressions or feedback about how they interpreted basically around, I mean, you touched a little bit on it, Michael, about the education, right? So not just the superintendent, because at the end of the day, the mayor is the superintendent's boss. So as far as some of the campaign now on the radio recently, I heard a negative campaign targeted towards the Andrea Campbell about special education funding. She wants to take special education funding and students funding to be privatized in charter schools and things like that. But I'd like to know, what were your impressions of where they stand with the school systems and education? Because we've seen that it's one of the three top things that Boston residents are interested in, what's happening with our schools. And the lots of things have happened with the whole debate with the exam schools and things like that. So I'm wondering what your impressions were with where they stand on education in general, but some of our most vulnerable students, the special education students.
Thank you, Roxy. I'm going to take two other questions and then I have my panel respond. Paul Watanabe, Professor.
Well, can I say that beginning with this idea of giving grades, it reflects such lazy questioning, I think, by the questioners. The notion that you're going to talk about education and simply just discuss it in terms of giving a grade without some of the nuanced questions like that Lorna Rivera asked. What do they think about an elected as opposed to an appointed school system? And they all talk about, for example, getting beyond the discussion about the exam schools, which tends to dominate the discussion, and ignoring the great majority of the students, the 54,000 students within the system who are not going to go to the 3% of the students that are going to go to those 3 exam schools. How are we going to make the system as a whole function better for those people? For those candidates who talked about it, we want some specifics about that. But let me ask questions about 2 of the candidates and maybe later, and Barrows and Janey. Janie, I think, is an accidental mayor and an accidental candidate. She would not have been even considering running for this position had Walsh been in the position. And I think it reflects a little bit on her performance so far. She's sort of trying to keep the city running steady, very much along the lines that Walsh would have done so. And I think her vision for the future is not very much well established because she's never really had the thought about this prior to Walsh stepping down as mayor. And Barros, I think, is in an interesting position because at times he's very critical of what Janie has been able to do, for example, on the education front. And yet at other times when Janie talks about the accomplishments on public safety, he claims that much of that is due to the fact that he was a member of the Walsh administration. So Barros is doing the classic thing. He's picking and choosing. There's parts of him being a part of the Walsh administration that he wants to surround himself with, and parts about being part of the Walsh administration, which he's a part of, that he wants to blame others for being responsible for. In some ways, he's picking and choosing in terms of that experience with the Walsh administration. But I just wonder what your thoughts are in terms of their two strategies. And I must say that I am sort of a friend both of Barros and I'm sort of part of the Janie and the Walsh and the Janie and the Walsh administration position. So there's no animus that I have towards them. I just think that their positions are reflective of some of this dynamic. And the fact is that Andrea Campbell and Wu have the most laid out sort of arguments for change and the best plans. And part of that is the fact that they have the guts, and I think it was guts, to announce that they're going to run against the Mayor Walsh even before he had stepped down from his position, in a way in which Barros did not do so and would not have done so. Janie did not do so, and Asabi George only stepped in after Walsh stepped aside.
Great analysis, Paul. Thank you so much. A question from Cherry Hill. Sherry Hill, I'm sorry.
Hi, everybody. Let's see. There we go. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for hosting this, and also thank you for hosting the debate last night as well, your contributions to this really important conversation.
Yes.
So, of course, schools are a salient issue. I agree with Professor Johnson when he said that when asked, Andrea Campbell punted on responding to the pro-charter school interests supporting her campaign. But I also personally feel that her response that BPS needs to be improved, the Boston Public Schools, like individually, to be able to compete with the idea of even, to be able to compete, say like in the market with charter schools, with the exam schools, and also the idea of creating another VOTEC school is a great idea. How important do you think the prospect of improving other Boston public schools to compete with school choice is to voters? I guess, I don't know if that's more of a polling question or like historically maybe, or also just given the moment due to the COVID pandemic, the exam schools, the changes to the exam schools admissions last year. Yeah, and just the dire need that some of the Boston public schools have for improvements.
Thank you, thanks, Sherry. Panelists, so we had 3 questions, and most of them were substantively on school and educational reform. So please, let's start with Trevor, Erin, and then Michael, briefly, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so if I could respond to the education question, I would say John Barris, to me, had the most substantive plan. I believe he's calling for $4 billion investment in Boston public schools, and he wants to add a school to every neighborhood. So I think, to me, that was the most substantial plan that I could think of from the debate that is actually concentrated on doing something right now. And I believe his cost will also eliminate the busing costs from that. So I think he came with the most substantial plan. I also think Andrea's connection to the city, I believe she said she went to all PBS, Boston Public Schools. So I think that was a very good way of connecting with Boston residents, in that she understands the conditions presented at every school. And the fact that she wants to make every school as competitive as the exam schools, I think that's very good. I think we should try and make it so that kids from Mattapan and Back Bay have the same graduation rates and have the same chances of success. So I think that was very good from the candidates. Regarding the other question from Paul, I would say, the candidates, they are kind of going with the political winds, which I understand. And a lot of things have been changing in Boston. I think Barros is trying to stand out, but in some instances, it's hard. It's kind of a crowded field and a lot of the policies overlap. And that's why I think Michelle Wu, in a sense, is leading, because a lot of her ideas are sort of more bold than the candidates. So I think that's why she's polling a little bit better, in my opinion. But other than that, I think like Kim Janey, she could maybe, I felt like she was very pedestrian in a way, in a lot of her answers to me. And I feel like she should be more forceful in some of her ideas and what she's done to the city of Boston. So I would say it looks like, as Paul said, she didn't really want to be in the race to me. But like, I would hope she can be more forceful and because there's some things that she's done in the 5 months, but they're not at the forefront, I feel. I feel like they're kind of shrouded in a sense, and she needs to speak up more about what she's doing for the city and what she's done. And I think that will help her. But I think she's been very pedestrian lately, which isn't good for her campaign.
Good answers, Trevor. Erin.
I would say Sherry asked a question, and it bleeds into the first question about education policy. How much education policy was there? And then Sherry asked, how important is education policy K through 12 to voters? And I think one last night, like the question Lorna asked didn't come up. So it felt pretty surface level in terms of last night. But I would say the challenge for all 5 of these candidates is that it's a mayor's race, and it's a huge school district. Education is at the top of many voters' agenda in terms of how they're evaluating these candidates. But when we dig a little deeper there, some people really want to dig into, should there be an elected or appointed school board? Some people are really vested in the exam school debate. Other people are like, hey, we need to improve all schools. Like, let's not pay so much attention to the 3%, what Paul Watanabe said. And then other people are like, just get the buses to run on time, And so education is a key criteria for many Boston voters. But once you dig a little deeper, what within education they care about differs. And so that's why I think when Walsh ran against John Conley, it became so simplified that, Conley was for charter schools and Walsh wasn't. And that was something that voters, I don't know if that's completely accurate, but that was the message that got to voters, and it provided a very easy, quick criterion by which to make the choice. And in this race, to my mind, we haven't had that same definitive definition. And so no one's emerged as the education candidate. And in terms of Paul Watanabe's points, I agree with pretty much all of them. I think Barros suffers, I already said, from the path dependency issue in terms of when he got in. There's nothing wrong with that being an accidental mayor, but you don't want to be an accidental candidate. It takes courage in Boston to be Campbell or Wu and step up and say, I'm going to run against Marty Walsh, when he had a heck of a coalition and Tito Jackson did not perform well at the polls against him. And I do think it was a little unfair. Barros, not in last night's debate, but critiqued Janey for using some of the Walsh data. But the Walsh data she was using was to say that crime is actually down, in part to Trevor's point. So let's not have another 80s scare tactic, let's not have another 80s scare tactic that crime is bad and now we get tough. And who do we get tough on? So I think her point was to say that crime's down. That's not to say that crime isn't wildly problematic in terms of who it happens to, but let's not reinvent that 80s wheel of crime's bad, lock everybody up.
Thank you, Erin. Michael?
I think we focus on exam schools as opposed to the much broader universe of all public schools, because it's an understandable issue. You know, there are 3 exam schools, and we think we're familiar with the rules that it takes to be in there. But I think the debate about them is worthwhile because they get to core issues of equity, access, and excellence. And I would like the responsible candidates who engage in the exam school issue to connect the principles at play here with the larger issues for public schools all across the city. You know, what does it mean for a school to be excellent, and what kinds of criteria do we want to make schools attractive? I think we can connect the exam school debate to more schools. I think we don't know, the general public doesn't know how hard it is to provide good basic education. We don't know much about the mechanics of pedagogy, of parents choosing schools. I think we need more basic information. I think just as when we talk about crime, the conversation has turned to root causes, maybe for public education as well. Maybe Boston is such a hard place to live that parents with 2 or 3 jobs don't have the time to supervise their children to do excellent in schools as middle-class families, but I don't see much talk about that.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Erin, and thank you, Trevor. We are 1 minute shy of noon, and so we have to close. I'm afraid we're not going to be able to take any more questions. However, this is, first event that we're having post-COVID, return to campus. The election is on, the first election is on Tuesday. There will be another debate. We will co-host that with WBUR and the Boston Globe. And we will have another policy discussion like this one with a panel sometime in October before the November elections. So thank you again. Thank you for joining us. And good evening. Have a great day. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.